A School of Her Own by Arleta Richardson. Chapter 9. The Rotten Apples. Sarah Jane was pleased with the invitation to come for the weekend and attend the quilting bee. "There is absolutely no one my age to talk to all week long," she said. "I'm either conversing with infants or old folks. Sometimes I think there's not much difference between them."
"Some of your students are almost as old as you are," I reminded her. "Don't you talk to them?"
"I end up talking at them, not to them," she replied. "Besides, the things that come up in conversation at school aren't high on my interest list. It will be fun to visit for 2 days without correcting someone's grammar." She arrived Friday afternoon, and we had time for a walk before supper.
"Oh, this is so much fun!" I exclaimed. "It's just like being young again. No worries or cares."
"Mabel," Sarah Jane interrupted me. "We are young. And when did we not have worries and cares of some kind?"
"You know what I mean," I replied. "Compared to what I have now, our childhood was one long summer day."
She nodded. "I guess I know what you mean. No one is responsible for making our decisions but ourselves. We are the adult population, whether we like it or not." We walked along quietly for a moment, and then Sarah Jane asked, "Did Abe come to school all this week?"
"Yes, he was there. At least, his body was. I have a feeling that things haven't improved between him and his father. I haven't noticed any more bruises, but the girls say he gets whipped pretty regularly."
"The man ought to be reported," Sarah Jane said. "Has he stayed away from school?"
"He hasn't come into the room, but several times I've seen him watching the playground or just leaning against a tree and staring at the schoolhouse. He makes me nervous," I admitted. "But I don't want to confront him. He may be just checking up on Abe."
Sarah Jane's expression said she didn't believe that for one single minute. To be truthful, neither did I. Friday evening passed quickly and happily. We played games, popped corn, and sang around the organ where Mrs. Williams played. When we were getting ready for bed, Sarah Jane made a surprising observation. "Some girls don't have even one young man interested in them, and you have 2 men falling at your feet. Do you think that's a fair and equitable arrangement?" I looked at her blankly.
"2 men?"
"Why, yes, Russ and Len."
"Sarah Jane, have you taken leave of your senses? Len doesn't even know I'm alive. As far as he's concerned, I'm just like his cousin Alice."
"That's where you're mistaken, Mabel," Sarah Jane replied. "Len is crazy about you. I don't know why you haven't seen it."
"There's nothing to see," I scoffed. "I hardly ever talk to him unless the whole family is around. And," I thought, "that's the way it's going to stay. I won't give anyone a chance to gossip about either one of us."
Saturday morning dawned clear and cool. A perfect late October day. We were up early to get ready for the quilting bee. "You have enough food ready to feed the whole community," Mr. Williams remarked. "Are you ladies planning on eating all of that?" "You know we aren't, John," Mrs. Williams replied. "The menfolk will be there at noon, and food disappears when they show up." As soon as we finished prayer and the breakfast dishes were done, Len brought the buggy around. The food was put in, and we were ready to leave. It took only a few minutes to get to the gauges and carry our baskets into the house. Len went back to work, planning to return with the other men and boys for dinner. I had never been in the Gage house. I looked around with interest. It had been built the year Michigan became a state, 1837. It looked much the same as most farmhouses, but the kitchen had a big walk-in fireplace that the others didn't have. Mr. Gage's grandfather had said he couldn't live in a home that had nothing but a cook stove in the kitchen. Mrs. Gage had been heard to say that was because he never had to cook in it, keep the fire going in it, or clean up after it. Nevertheless, she admitted that the room wouldn't be the same without a fire in the winter. Next to the kitchen was a large living room. The 2 rooms were separated by a large double door that was folded back so they became one large area. There was a real holiday spirit as the ladies arrived and placed their food on the pine table that had extra leaves in for the occasion. "I thought we might like to eat outside this noon," Mrs. Gage said to Mrs. Williams. "We'll see what it's like when the men get here, and it won't take any time to have the tables set up. My, I'm glad you've all come. Aren't we going to have a good day?"
"Aside from the schoolgirls, we'll be the youngest ladies here," Alice observed as we looked around at the big quilting frames set up in the middle of the room. "We'll get a corner, so we might as well have the one we want."
"Preferably at the end of the quilt that will be tucked under the mattress," said a voice behind us. I turned to find that Augusta Harris had come into the room. "I know," she said primly. "Everyone has to learn how to quilt sometime in her life. I'm just thankful beginners aren't learning on one of mine." She glanced over at me. "And you are?"
"Mabel O'Dell," I replied and put out my hand. "And this is my friend, Sarah Jane Clark."
Augusta was flustered. "Oh, the new schoolteacher. Well, I wasn't including you, of course, although I must say, you don't look old enough or strong enough to take care of those big boys."
"We're doing nicely, thank you," I said.
Augusta sniffed. From what I hear, maybe a little too nicely. You'll want to watch your step, young lady." She turned and marched off to join the other women in the kitchen.
"Now, what did she mean by that?"
I asked in bewilderment.
"Don't pay any attention to Augusta," Alice advised me. "She likes to stir up a little excitement and leave people wondering what she knows. 9 times out of 10, she doesn't know anything."
"I wouldn't be too sure about that this time, Alice." We turned, and I found myself looking into a pair of cool gray eyes. They belonged to a girl about my age, tall, slender, and very pretty. "So, you are Mabel O'Dell," she said to me. "I must say you're about what I expected you to be." She continued to survey me critically. "I suppose it's that look of innocence that lets you get by with it."
"I don't believe I've met you,"
I said, feeling my anger rise.
"This is Elizabeth Lawton," Alice quickly interposed.
So this was Elizabeth. I opened my mouth to inquire about what it was that I might be getting away with when Sarah Jane nudged me from behind. "Don't even ask," she murmured. Elizabeth swept her cool glance over Sarah Jane and wandered off to talk with someone else. My, Sarah Jane commented. "You are simply surrounded by friends. What have you been doing that I don't know about?" I was speechless. What had I been doing that even I didn't know about? Alice sighed and led us over to the chairs surrounding the quilting frame.
"I had hoped she wouldn't be here today. Her middle name is Trouble." "Is this the Elizabeth who informed the world that I had set my cap for Len?"
I demanded. Alice looked surprised.
"You've heard about that?" "Not directly," I replied, "but things have a way of getting back to one. What right has she to say something like that? And just where does she get her information?"
"Don't splutter, Mabel," Sarah Jane said. "I don't blame you for being angry, but you can't handle it by getting defensive." Sarah Jane turned to Alice. "I take it this Elizabeth has her eye on Len for herself?" Alice nodded.
"She has ever since the Lawtons have lived here. Her mother died when Abe was born. Elizabeth was 5 years old when Cy Lawton married the wife he has now. Maybe that's the reason for Mr. Lawton's harsh treatment of Abe,"
I thought. Then I remembered that I was the one being picked on this time.
"Elizabeth has been working and boarding in town since she finished school," Alice continued. "But she's always home on the weekend. She wants to make sure that no one else is taking an interest in Len." "She doesn't need to worry about me," I snapped. "I wouldn't have Len if she gift-wrapped him for me."
Alice looked startled, and Sarah Jane grinned. "Mabel's upset," she told Alice. "She'll simmer down and start making sense again before long." I glared at Sarah Jane and jabbed furiously at the quilt in front of me. Even my best friend was against me. I was forced to pull myself together as more ladies arrived and I was introduced to the mothers of my students. Mrs. Elliott was a warm, comfortable-looking woman, and I was pleased to tell her how well her boys were doing in school. Prudence and Mrs. Edwards came in, followed by Mrs. Abbott, mother of the twins. I looked around to see if I could locate Mrs. Lawton, but she apparently had not come. The last to arrive was Mrs. Matthews with Elsie. I liked Amelia Matthews immediately. Her smile was bright and she grasped my hand eagerly. "I'm so glad to meet you, Miss O'Dell. Elsie has enjoyed school more this year than she ever has before." I was surprised, as I hadn't seen much indication that Elsie enjoyed much of anything. What had she been like when she wasn't enjoying school, I wondered.
"Thank you," I replied. "Elsie is doing well. She's quieter than most of my students, but that can be a blessing sometimes."
I smiled at Elsie and was rewarded with a faint look of pleasure. They sat down across from us. Prudence came to join Elsie. Soon everyone was stitching busily and visiting back and forth across the table. I carried on a conversation, but my heart wasn't in it. In spite of myself, my mind kept going back to Elizabeth's remarks. What did I have to feel guilty about? Sarah Jane's voice broke into my musing. "Isn't that so, Mabel?"
"Sorry, I didn't hear what you said."
"I know you didn't. That's just what I was telling Alice. You could sit right there, looking alive, and never know if the whole room got up and walked away. Are you still brooding about that Lawton girl?"
"I was not brooding,"
I replied crossly.
"I was thinking. Things are beginning to get out of hand here, and I don't even know why."
"Don't worry about it," Alice advised.
"You're doing a good job, and the parents are pleased that you are here. There are always a couple of rotten apples in every barrel."
I was comforted somewhat by Alice's words and decided to try to ignore the rotten apples and enjoy the rest of the day. As noon approached, the big tables were set up in the yard, and we began the task of bringing dishes, silverware, and food out from the kitchen. Fried chicken, ham, salads, vegetables, fresh bread, and pies and cakes in abundance were spread across one table. By the time the men and boys began to arrive, the lemonade was ready to pour, and we sat down to enjoy the feast. Mr. Williams and Len joined us, and I was pleased to note Elizabeth's annoyance that Len had not chosen to sit with her. My pleasure was short-lived, however. As soon as the meal was over, Elizabeth appeared at Len's side.
"Do you have time for a little walk before you go back to work?" she asked him. "I have some plans for next Sunday that I'd like to talk over with you."
"Why, yes, I guess I have time." Len glanced at me, but I looked away and began to talk to Sarah Jane. Elizabeth wasn't going to get a rise out of me. Nevertheless, I felt an unexpected stab of jealousy. I could very easily dislike this girl, and for what reason? After all, I had Russ. Len meant nothing to me. It was all very confusing, and my heart was not lightened by hearing the voice of Augusta Harris wafting over the table. "I knew we'd have nothing but trouble with a young lady teaching school. It takes a man to handle a job like that." I shrugged and looked at Sarah Jane, who squeezed my hand. "Go get him, Mabel," she said, and grinned. End of chapter 9.